Hi everyone, it's Lisa. Thank you for joining me today. Today we're going to take a look at the LeMoyne Star. Take a look at a pretty one before we open the kimono and look at what's behind it. The LeMoyne Star is comprised of a square block of 4 corner squares, as you see in the white, 4 triangles that happen to be quarter square triangles, and we'll talk a little bit more about those, and 8 45-degree diamonds. You can make this block in any size that you like, but we're going to not look at specific sizes, but rather look at the relationship of each of the items to the other. So here we have a block of an indeterminate size, and we're going to express all of these blocks in terms of x, which is the size of a square. So if we look across the width of our block, look at this purple line, we have 2 finished squares, and we have a length of the hypotenuse of that square. Now the hypotenuse is basically the long side of a triangle. If you know 2 sides of a triangle, this line here, the hypotenuse, is going to be a squared plus b squared is equal to this squared. Because a and b on a square is equal to each other by definition of a square, then the diagonal of any square is always going to be the square root of 2. That's what Pythagoras tells us. And the square root of 2 is 1.414. So now we can take this and express the size of the finished block as x, this block, plus x again, this block, plus 1.414x. So these are the lengths. So the finished block is equal to 3.414x, and we have to employ some algebra here. So if we're solving for x, x is going to be the finished block divided by 3.414. So once you have the size of your square, then you can compute the size of the square that you need for your quarter square triangle, which is your finished square times 1.414. Now remember, these are finished block sizes. We haven't added seam allowance yet, so you wouldn't be cutting from this. This is just how the components would measure in your block. All right, so we've taken care of the very top. But now if we move down to this area of the block here, we're going to take some other measurements, and let's look at what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the square, which we've already solved for, and we have 2 of them, and we have 2 diamonds. And the green here denotes what the diamond height is. All right? So this is the diamond height. All right? That's how you measure the height of a diamond. You don't measure it over here. You don't measure it over here. You measure it at the widest points. And this is typically what your strip width is when you cut. All right? So if we want to find the size of our diamond, and we've already solved for our squares, then we know that the finished block size minus twice our finished squares is going to give us this measurement here, which is the 2 diamonds together. All right? And because it's 2 diamonds, we have to divide that in half to get the height of the diamond, which is in green. So the finished block minus twice the size of the finished squares divided by 2 is going to be equal to the size of the diamond height. So now let's talk about seam allowance. We need to add our seam allowance, and let's move down here. Our seam allowance for a square is our calculated X, and we're going to add a 1/2 inch, just as you are used to doing. The seam allowance for a diamond is the same thing. We're going to add a 1/2 inch. Our seam allowance for our quarter square triangle is going to be one of two things. If you're cutting from a square, you're going to take this length and you're going to add 1.25 to it because you're going to be cutting on 2 diagonals. If you are cutting from a strip width, meaning you're basically putting your strip, all right, you're putting your strip and you're taking your triangle ruler and you're making this cut here, right? If you're doing that, then you would just add a 1/2 inch to your strip width and make your cut that way. And the other thing that's important for you to remember is that this needs to be straight of grain, and that's why we do a quarter square triangle. If you try to cut this from a half square, all right, if you made this from a half square, you would end up with bias. You know, on a half square triangle, this bias is enclosed in a seam. So if you just cut a square on the diagonal, you would end up with bias, and you never want that on the outside of your block. So make sure that you keep that in mind. I wasn't always so clear on that when I first started quilting, and I was having to teach myself. So you want straight of grain here, and you're going to have your biases here, all right, and then straight of grain on the outside, and that's pretty key. So that, my friends, is how you do the basic calculations of your integral parts for your LeMoyne Star that you are going to piece the traditional way. And I'm going to drag you through that process. I'm just going to add to the knowledge base. Again, I'm not an expert, but I am an expert learner, and I want to show you how I went about tackling this block so that I have consistent results that I'm happy with. Thanks for joining me.